You ready? Yes. Great. Good morning. I'm Doug Apple, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the board. This is the second meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing on or being renewed on or after October 1, 2025, and on or before September 30th, 2026. I'll now take roll call. Genesis Aquino, Alex Armlovich, Robert Ehrlich,
Present.
Arpit Gupta,
Present.
Reed Jordan,
Present.
Alex Schwartz, Christina Smith,
Present.
Adon Sultan,
Present.
Doug Apple, I'm also present. Let the record show we have a quorum. Next planning meeting of this board will be here at Spector Hall on April 17th, starting at 9:30. Staff will be presenting the 2025 Price Index of Operating Costs and the 2025 Mortgage Survey Report. In addition to staff reports, we'll hear presentations from HPD, CPC, and the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. Pardon me. The preliminary vote for rent-stabilized lease adjustments will be held April 30th. That's a Wednesday. This in-person meeting will start at 7 p.m. Be held at the LaGuardia Performing Arts Center at LaGuardia Community College in Long Island City, Queens. If you plan to attend, please use the entrance on Van Dam Street at the intersection of 47th Avenue. This meeting will also be live streamed via YouTube. Information regarding this meeting will be posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB, in our meetings section. The public can also live stream our meetings via YouTube at youtube.com/Rent Guidelines Board. Information regarding this meeting will be posted at our website, nyc.gov/RGB, in our meeting section, and the same time will be sent to those who are on our email list. If you're interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on RGB email updates under quick links. Today, staff will present the 2025 Income and Affordability Study. A copy of the report is in your meeting folder. There are copies of this report here today and will be made available on our website after the meeting. A copy of the INA presentation will also be posted on our website. Just click Research on our homepage to download these documents. After the staff presentation of the INA report and board discussion, we'll hear from our guest speaker, Mark Willis, Senior Policy Fellow at the NYU Furman Center. And for the board members, please note the annual Conflicts of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report filing period has begun and will end on May 2nd. If you've not received the COIB package, let Andrew know. I now want to introduce Daniel Berger, RGB Co-Research Director, who will be presenting the 2025 Income and Affordability Study. And to try to make it easier for some, we moved the presentation. I don't know if, can you see down there, Christina?
It'll be fine.
It'll be fine? Okay.
There's a printout of the slides in your folder too, Christina, so if you can't see, you can follow along there. Yeah. And everyone, when you speak, the mic, if you may remember to turn your mics on. Thanks.
Good morning. The Income and Affordability Study is researched and presented each year in accordance with Section 26-510B of the Rent Stabilization Law, which requires the Rent Guidelines Board to consider relevant data from the current and projected cost of living indices and permits consideration of other measures of housing affordability in its deliberations. To assist the board in meeting this obligation, RGB research staff produce an annual income and affordability study, which reports on housing affordability and tenant income in New York City's rental market. The study highlights year-to-year changes in many of the major economic factors affecting New York City's tenant population and takes into consideration a broad range of market forces, rent levels, and public policies affecting housing affordability. Such factors include New York City's overall economic condition, including unemployment rates and inflation rates, as well as household income and housing costs. and other relevant factors such as the number of eviction proceedings and homelessness levels. In summary, 2024 saw the number of cash assistance recipients in New York City increasing by 16.2%, and the number of food stamp recipients, now known as SNAP, increasing by 3.0%. But there was growth in gross city product, which in inflation-adjusted or real terms is forecast to increase by 2.1% during calendar year 2024. The unemployment rate rose to 5.3%, up 0.3 percentage points. Businesses in the city also gained an average of 103,300 jobs, a 2.2% increase. Inflation rose at the same pace as the previous year, with prices rising by 3.8% on average during 2024 in the metro area. Average inflation-adjusted wages decreased by 0.4% over the prior 12 months, while nominal wages increased by 3.1%. As of October 24, 2024, New York State ERAP program has made 240,624 payments on behalf of tenants for rent assistance within New York City. The average payment amount was $12,003. Including asylum seekers, homeless levels in DHS shelters rose by 8.6% and rose by 8.7% excluding asylum seekers. In housing court, non-payment filings fell 11.7%, and non-payment calendared cases fell 6.1%. Evictions also increased from 11,186 to 13,711, a 22.6% increase. And data from the 2023 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, which shows that rent-stabilized tenants, excluding those receiving rental assistance, had a median gross rent-to-income ratio of 28.8%. For all rent-stabilized tenants, the median household income is $60,000, median contract rent is $1,500, and the vacancy rate for rent-stabilized rental units was 0.98%. As this graph illustrates, 2024 saw rising unemployment rates for both New York City and the nation as a whole. The New York City rate is in purple and was 5.3% in 2024, an increase of 0.3 percentage points. The U.S. jobless rate is in green and was 4.0% in 2024, a 0.4 percentage point increase. As this graph shows, businesses based in New York City gained jobs in 2024. There was an average annual increase of 103,300 jobs in 2024, a 2.2% increase from 2023 total job levels. This is the highest level of employment ever recorded in New York City and an increase of 2.7% over 2019 levels. The rate of inflation, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, which measures the change in the cost of typical household goods, rose at the same pace during 2024 as 2023, increasing by 3.8% in the New York City metro area. Note that the CPI is not exclusive to New York City, as the study area extends into the suburbs of New York City. This rate was tied for the second highest increase since 2008 in the New York City metro area. However, inflation was higher in early 2025, with a 4.1% average inflation rate in January and February of 2025. For comparison, the U.S. CPI for urban consumers increased by 2.9% in 2024, 1.2 percentage points lower than the previous year. Note that the Bureau of Labor Statistics also produces special aggregate indices of CPI, such as indices for all items less shelter, energy, and all items less medical care. We will talk more in depth about the all items less shelter index on the next slide. The CPI for all items less shelter is a special aggregate index published by the BLS that includes all costs except those for shelter. This index rose at the same pace in 2024 as the previous year, an increase in the New York City metro area of 2.6%. The costs contained in this index account for 60% of all costs in the metro area. The CPI can also be disaggregated for changes in specific components of this index. The cost of food and beverages rose by 1.8% in 2024, down from a 5.0% increase in 2023. Apparel costs fell by 1.5%, down from a 3.1% increase in the prior year. Medical care costs fell by 0.8% for the second consecutive year. Recreation costs rose by 4.6%, up slightly from a 4.5% increase in 2023. The cost of electricity rose by 13.0%, up from a 1.2% increase in the prior year. And tuition, school fees, and childcare costs increased by 2.0%, down from a 3.3% increase in 2023. Shelter expenses account for 40% of expenses in the New York City metro area. The shelter component increased by 5.6% in 2024 and follows an increase of 5.8% in 2023, a 0.2 percentage point decrease. The shelter component consists of two major expense items, including rent of primary residence. Rent of primary residence in the CPI increased by 4.9% in 2024 in the New York City metro area. This was the second highest increase since 2028, but a decrease of 0.8 percentage points from 2023. However, it was lower than the U.S. CPI for rent in 2024, an increase of 5.1%. As reported by the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, and as this graph shows, nominal average wages rose in the most recent 12-month period, which runs from the fourth quarter of 2023 through the third quarter of 2024. However, inflation-adjusted average wages fell. Real wages are shown in 2024 dollars and decreased by 0.4%, while nominal wages increased by 3.1%. Moving on to cash assistance recipients, the dark purple portion of the graph shows the number of recipients in the Family Assistance Program, and the lighter purple shows the number of recipients in the Safety Net Assistance Program. The green bars represent the number of recipients who have converted from the Family Assistance Program to the Safety Net Assistance Program. In 2024, total cash assistance cases rose by 16.2%. Other indicators of public assistance, not shown here, include SNAP recipients, which increased by 3.0% in 2024, and Medicaid enrollees, which rose by 5.5%. The New York State Emergency Rental Assistance Program, authorized in 2021, expended $3.5 billion towards helping eligible New Yorkers pay rent and utility arrears. Of all the applications for rent arrears in New York State, 73% of applications, or 297,021, came from residents of New York City. As of October 2024, 240,624 payments were issued on behalf of New York City tenants for rental assistance, or 78% of the total payments within New York State. The payments for rent arrears in New York City totaled $2.3 billion, with another $620 million expended for prospective rent payments, for a total of $2.9 billion, or 82% of the total value of payments within New York State. This map shows the total number of payments and the average payment amount by borough as of October 28, 2024. The average payment for both rent arrears and prospective rent was $12,003 in New York City, compared to $9,070 in the balance of the state. As illustrated in the map on this slide, average payments were lowest in the Bronx, $10,411, and highest in Queens, $14,541. This chart shows sheltered homelessness levels for those in DHS facilities during calendar years 1994 through 2024. As you can see, levels increased in 2024 by 8.6% on average, including asylum seekers newly arrived to New York. Excluding asylum seekers, the average DHS shelter census increased at nearly the same rate, 8.7% in 2024. Moving on to housing court, average annual non-payment filings in Housing Court decreased, falling by 11.7% to 96,443 in 2024. There were 56,651 non-payment cases scheduled for a hearing, known as calendared cases, a decrease of 6.1%. There were 13,711 residential evictions for both non-payment and holdover cases in 2024, a 22.6% increase from the 11,186 in 2023. Results from the 2023 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey were released in February of 2024. This triennial survey provides data on the housing and demographic characteristics of New York City residents, including affordability of housing, rents, incomes, and vacancy rates for both renter and occupied housing. It is also the only survey that is able to provide data specifically for rent-stabilized tenants. Detailed HVS data can be found in last year's Income and Affordability Study report and the same presentation, but a brief summary will be presented here. According to the 2023 HVS, which reflects household income for 2022, the median income for rental households was $70,000. Rent-stabilized tenants had a median household income of $60,000 in 2022. And for tenants living in rent-stabilized buildings built before 1974, the median household income was also $60,000 and was $50,000 in buildings built in 1974 or later. Tenants living in market rentals had higher household incomes than rent-stabilized tenants, a median of $90,800 in 2022. Looking at rent levels in 2023, the median monthly contract rent, which does not include fuel and utilities, for all rental units was $1,641. Rent-stabilized tenants paid less than a typical rental tenant, with a median contract rent of $1,500, including a median of $1,471 for tenants in buildings built prior to 1974, and $1,627 for tenants in buildings built in 1974 or later, while tenants living in market rentals paid a median of $2,000 a month. The HVS can also provide data on gross rent-to-income ratios. Generally speaking, housing is considered affordable when a household pays no more than 30% of its income towards gross rent. Excluding units that receive Section 8, which generally pay no more than 30% of their income towards rent, the median gross rent-to-income ratio for all rental households was 28.2%. Rent-stabilized tenants had a median of 28.8%, and for tenants living in rent-stabilized buildings built before 1974, the median was 28.3%, and was 31.5% in buildings built in 1974 or later. Tenants in market rentals had a lower median gross rent-to-income ratio than rent-stabilized tenants, a median of 27.3%. We can also calculate the proportion of households that are considered rent-burdened or paying more than 30% of their income towards contract rent. For all rental units, this proportion was 43.1%. Rent-stabilized tenants were more rent-burdened than the typical rental tenant, with a proportion of 45.5%, including 43.8% of tenants in buildings built prior to 1974, and 53.0% of tenants in buildings built in 1974 or later, while 40.6% of tenants living in market rentals were considered rent-burdened. This slide shows the median gross rent-to-income ratio for rent-stabilized tenants, excluding those who receive Section 8, from New York City Housing and Vacancy Surveys from 2005 through 2023. As the chart shows, the lowest rate was in 2023, 28.8%, and the highest rates were in 2014 and 2017, both at 35.5%. The HVS also reports on vacancy rates for rental housing. The vacancy rate for all rental households was 1.41% in 2023. This is the lowest rate since the inception of the HVS, and significantly lower than the rate in 2021, which was 4.54%. For rent-stabilized units, the vacancy rate was lower than that of all rental households, 0.98%. The HVS also surveys respondents on various financial hardships they may have recently experienced. These hardships include missing a rent payment in the past year due to not having money when the rent was due, which was reported by 13% of rental households. For those households who reported missing a rent payment in the past year, 34% were currently in rent arrears. The 2023 HVS also asked respondents about their level of food insecurity over the past year, and 17% of renter households reported food insecurity over the past year, including 21% of rent-stabilized households and 12% of market-rate households. Another source of rent and income information is the annual American Community Survey conducted by the Census Bureau. The most recent data from this survey is from 2023. Note that ACS data from 2020 is not able to be compared to data from other years. Unlike the HVS, which is able to be stratified for rent-stabilized tenants, the ACS provides data for all renters in New York City, regardless of regulation status. Looking at median gross rent-to-income ratios from this survey from 2010 through 2023, the rates have ranged from a low of 30.1% in 2019 to a high of 32.7% in 2014. The ratio was 31.1% in 2023, a 0.1 percentage point decrease from 2022. The American Community Survey also reports on the proportion of households who are considered rent-burdened and severely rent-burdened. That is, households paying at least 30% or 50% of their income towards gross rent, respectively. The totality of each column in this graph represents the number of households paying at least 30% of their income towards gross rent. Looking at these ratios from 2010 through 2023, the proportion of households paying at least 30% of their income towards rent has ranged from a low of 50.1% in 2019 to a high of 55.5% in 2014. The ratio was 51.9% in 2023, a 0.2 percentage point decrease from 2022. Looking at monthly contract and gross rents from 2010 through 2023 and real 2023 dollars shows that from 2010 to 2023, rent has increased in inflation-adjusted terms by approximately $250 a month for both contract and gross rent. In 2023, the latest available data, median contract rent was $1,624, an inflation-adjusted decrease of 0.6% from 2022, and median gross rent was $1,748, an inflation-adjusted decrease of 0.3% from 2022. The American Community Survey also reports on renter housing costs as a percentage of income for different income brackets. As household income increases, so does housing affordability. In 2023, 87.8% of households making less than $20,000 a year had a rent-to-income ratio in excess of 30%. But for those households making at least $75,000 a year, the ratio who spend at least 30% of income on rent drops to 18.2%. To help measure income inequality, the ACS provides average household incomes for cities in quintiles. Each quintile represents 20% of household incomes within New York City. And analyzing the change in these quintiles over time can provide long-term insight into income inequality. While not consistently true year to year, over the period from 2006 to 2023, the earliest and latest years available for analysis, income in New York City increased more rapidly for higher quintiles than for lower quintiles. As the chart shows, between 2006 and 2023, there was an average annual decrease of 0.5% for the lowest quintile, but an increase of 1.4% each year for the highest quintile. Not illustrated here, between 2022 and 2023, the two most recent years of data, household incomes in the lowest quintile increased by 2.0% in real terms compared to the previous year, while income in both the second and third quintiles decreased by 1.0% and 1.2% respectively. Income in the fourth quintile increased by 0.2%, and income in the highest quintile increased by 0.1%. This graph illustrates the poverty rate for New York City individuals and New York City renter-occupied family households per the American Community Survey. As the purple bars on this graph show, the poverty rate for individuals in New York City in 2023 fell just slightly from 2022 by 0.1 percentage points and was 18.2% compared to 12.5% for the United States as a whole, which is not shown on this graph. The graph also shows the poverty rate for renter-occupied family households, shown in green. This rate was unchanged from 2022 and was 20.5% in 2023, compared to 5.7% for owner-occupied households, which is not shown on this graph. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. Census Bureau launched a new survey initiative, the Household Pulse Survey. The first survey was conducted at the end of April 2020, and the last survey was conducted in September 2024. A total of 7 surveys were conducted since the last INA was published, extending from March 2024 through September 2024. In addition to data for the U.S. as a whole, data is also available for 15 metro areas, including the New York City metro area, which extends into the suburbs of New York City, a population of 20 million persons. Among the questions asked of respondents regarding housing is whether they are caught up on rent. Over the 7 surveys conducted between March 2024 and September 2024, the average proportion of renter households in the New York City metro area who reported they were not current on their rent was 15.6%, down from 18.5% in the prior year. This compares to 12.0% of renter households nationwide who reported they were not current on their rent, up slightly from 11.9% in the prior year. Of those in the New York City metro area not caught up on rent in the past year, 21.9% reported they were 0 months behind, 21.1% were 1 month behind, and 16.1% were 2 months behind. 26.5% were 3 to 7 months behind, and 14.4% were 8 or more months behind. For those who reported being behind at least 1 month, the average is 3.57 months, virtually unchanged from 3.55 months in the prior year. The survey also asked respondents for their household income. The proportion of those who were not caught up on rent in the previous year is consistently higher for those with lower incomes, less than $35,000 a year, than for those with higher incomes, $100,000 a year or more. Over the 17 surveys conducted in the past 2 years, an average of 24.8% of lower income renter households in the New York City metro area reported not being caught up on rent, versus an average of 4.4% of the higher income households. As this graph illustrates, of the 15 metro areas delineated in the HPS, the New York City metro area had the second highest average proportion of households that reported being behind on rent between March 2024 and September 2024. The smallest ratios were in Phoenix and San Francisco, each with 7.8% of households reporting being behind on rent. The HPS also asked respondents if, and by how much, their rent has changed over the past 12 months, as illustrated in this chart of the New York City metro area. Across the 7 surveys conducted since the publication of the last INA study, an average of 32.7% of renter households in the New York City metro area reported that the rent had either not changed or decreased. 26.9% reported an increase of less than $100. 25.9% reported an increase between $100 and $249, and 14.6% reported an increase of at least $250. By household income, on average, those households with lower incomes saw smaller rent increases than those with higher incomes. For instance, for households making less than $35,000 a year, 37.3% reported that their rent had either not changed or decreased. But for households making $100,000 a year or more, a smaller proportion, 31.2%, reported the same. As illustrated in the chart, there was also a greater proportion of higher income households with rent increases of $250 or more. In June of 2023, the HBS began asking respondents if they had felt any pressure to move from any residence they had lived in over the past 6 months. Possible sources of pressure include the owner raising the rent, missing a rent payment, a lack of repairs, a change of locks, removal of belongings, or shutting off of utilities, a dangerous neighborhood, or any other pressure. In the last 7 surveys that asked this question, from March 2024 through September 2024, an average of 39.7% of renter households in the New York City metro area reported feeling pressure to move due to one of the reasons listed on this slide, a 1.5 percentage point decline from the average in the previous 8 surveys. While the previous INA study reported that approximately 38% of both lower income, those earning less than $35,000 annually, and higher income, earning $100,000 or more annually, renter households in the New York City metro area experienced pressure to move, the most recent 7 surveys showed lower income households reporting more pressure than higher income households, 43.9% versus 34.0% respectively. And of the 15 metro areas delineated in the HPS survey, the New York City metro area reported the third lowest proportion of households feeling pressure. In the U.S. as a whole, for comparison, an average of 40.9% of renters report pressure to move, a higher proportion than New York City. The most common pressures reported in the New York City metro were rent increases, as reported by 48.7% of New York City metro respondents who reported pressure, including 34.2% of lower income households and 62.2% of higher income households. Other common sources of pressure were other pressure, as reported by 30.1% of metro area renter households, and the owner not making repairs, as reported by 30.7% of households. As this graph illustrates, of the 15 metro areas delineated in the HBS, the New York City metro area has the third lowest proportion of renter households that felt pressure to move between March 2024 and September 2024. Smallest ratio was San Francisco, where 35.6% of renter households reported pressure to move, and the highest ratio was in Miami, where 50.6% of renter households felt pressure to move. Respondents were also asked if they had moved in the past 6 months. In the New York City metro area, 6.7% of renters overall reported moving, including 16.9% of those who felt pressure. For those renter households in the New York City metro area making less than $35,000 a year, 8.1% moved, including 18.4% of those feeling pressure. And for renter households making $100,000 a year or more, 5.0% moved, including 14.6% of those feeling pressure. This compares to the U.S. as a whole, where 9.3% of renters overall reported moving, including 22.8% of those who felt pressure. Of the 15 metros nationwide, the New York City metro has the lowest proportion of renter households that moved, and the second lowest proportion of renter households that moved due to pressure. To summarize, this table outlines some of the key indicators we have discussed during this presentation, with the change in each quarter and annually as compared to the same time period in 2023. A more detailed version of this table can be found in Appendices 1 and 2 of the report. In summary, for 2024, on an annual basis, the unemployment rate rose to 5.3%, up 0.3 percentage points. Businesses in the city also gained an average of 103,300 jobs, a 2.2% increase. New York City also saw growth in gross city product, which in inflation-adjusted or real terms is forecast to increase by 2.1% during calendar year 2024. Homeless staying in city shelters increased, rising by 8.6%, including asylum seekers, and 8.7% excluding asylum seekers. While the number of cash assistance recipients also increased by 16.2%, and the number of food stamp recipients, now known as SNAP, increased by 3.0%. The number of Medicaid enrollees also rose, up 5.5%, and in housing court, non-payment cases fell by 11.7% in 2024, and non-payment calendared cases fell by 6.1%. Residential evictions also rose, increasing by 22.6% in 2024, and with high inflation in place, average inflation-adjusted wages decreased by 0.4% over the prior 12 months. Thank you, and if you have any questions.
Thanks, Danielle. I have a couple questions. What is the second component of the shelter index? You mentioned rent being one.
Yes, it's outlined in the actual report. It's owner's equivalent of rent.
Okay. And for the cash assistance, are asylum seekers eligible for the city-funded cash assistance programs?
Yeah, we're trying to maybe get some more information on that. I did look up some, the HRA publishes quarterly reports where they outline every quarter how many people are in cash assistance. And it's not that many people. It's like 4 or 5% are asylum seekers.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's primarily asylum seekers, but I don't have
I
specific.
guess I'm trying to get at if the increase might be related to that. The increase in cash assistance recipients, which I think increased.
Yeah, I don't think so, just because it's primarily not asylum seekers, but.
Okay.
We did talk, and I
Yeah.
didn't actually follow up to talk to HRA, so.
Okay.
I'm going to put that on my to-do list, because I don't think so
Yeah, I wasn't-
either.
Yeah, I know federally
They
it's
are
not
eligible
allowed.
for certain emergency Medicaid benefits, for example, and I believe some SNAP benefits, but I don't think, but we should verify.
Yeah, we can try to verify, but as of the last quarter of 2024, it's only about 5% of people on cash assistance being asylum seekers.
I guess it'd be interesting to know, like, 3 years ago, what would that percentage be?
Yeah, I can.
Might have been
Yeah.
zero,
Yeah.
or very low.
And my last question is, would you know when ERAP expires?
I believe it's done. They haven't updated their reports
Okay.
since October.
So what,
ERAP's expired, but there are still applications that are pending. I think there's like one person working the office right now that's still dealing with those.
yeah, I guess the reason I'm asking is, so in 2020, you covered 2024 for the, when you had that data?
This is
on-
total numbers for all of ERAP. These numbers go through October 28th, 2024.
Okay, I guess it's important to take that into consideration, given that the, like, income and expense report, for example, that we looked at 2 weeks ago included ERAP payments. And now, going forward, that.
Yeah, it wasn't that many payments in 2024. So, but the numbers I presented were the total program, but
Cumulatively.
2023 certainly had a lot of payments.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Alex, at this point, I think when you're dealing with ERAP, it's probably just mainly appeals for
Yeah,
existing
yeah.
applications.
No, the
for
only reason
applications.
I'm asking is in thinking about the changes in income and expenses, that ERAP was part of the picture in
Right.
2023, it won't be. so much in 2024 and beyond.
And then Danielle, on that note, do we know, based on the ERAP payments, how many were for rent-stabilized units?
No, we cannot. I asked them last year, and they would not provide, I don't think they have that information, but
Okay.
they
And then
wouldn't.
also, just piggybacking on that, on the residential evictions, the increases, do we know how many were for rent-stabilized units? And do we know how many of those actual evictions where the tenants were restored based on payment by HRA or public assistance?
So in the report, it details, we can't get to an actual rent-stabilized unit. We can only get to buildings that contain rent-stabilized units. And it's in the report, but about 60% of the evictions are in units that are in buildings that contain rent-stabilized units. And it didn't move that much from the previous year. But these are actual evictions, so the person has been evicted.
Right, but also in a lot of eviction, just from our knowledge, in a lot of eviction cases, the tenants do end up getting restored to possession when the money
That I
is
don't,
paid. It's paid by public assistance, and
I mean,
I guess our bigger question is, I get it's rent-stabilized units in buildings,
but it's, I'm not a lawyer, you would know more about this than me, but it's not that the court granted an order of eviction, it's that the marshal went and evicted
I
them.
understand, I
Okay.
get that, but just for those who don't know, in a lot of
Okay.
the situations, there is subsequent proceedings wherein
Mm-hmm.
public assistance or HRA or some agency, city FAPs, whatnot, will end up paying those arrears, and
Tenant gets
the tenant
restored.
will get restored to possession.
While that is true, that's possible, I just want to, note that I would disagree that a lot of tenants who are in this predicament wind up being restored after a post-evict. Because we don't have data to prove that.
I don't have
Right. I'm
data.
just saying, I understand that is your experience, that is not my experience.
Just to also point out that I would say, all evictions, right, those funds that were never paid resulting in an eviction will never be paid. So that's dollar for dollar loss, right? If the tenant's been evicted, they were sheltered for sometimes 2 years without rental remittance.
Again, I think a lot of this is sort of anecdotal and experiential, and since we don't have the data for it, I think we should all take it with a grain of salt. I would also just say, as in counter to that, like, how many times have tenants been behind a large amount of rent, let's just say hypothetically, and then they were able to secure HRA funds or other funds, and then still wound up getting evicted because maybe they couldn't make up the entire difference, right? That's still money that's going to the landlord that the tenant, is effectuating the payment of the arrears and then still resulting in an eviction at the end of the day. So again,
That never happens. That literally,
okay. So
that literally never happens.
This is my point, right? Like,
Yeah, it's just, the eviction data is great. Evictions are down, right? If we look at this graph, it's going down each year. Landlords don't want evictions, they want rent. And so, just so we're clear on what actually happens in real time, those evictions are expensive for landlords. They lose all the money that they were seeking in an eviction, and it's not the welcomed outcome, is really the point.
to be clear, though, evictions were up this year.
No, they were down.
Right.
I'm sorry, they were up 22.6%.
Yeah, they were up, just so we're clear, right, about what the data was reflecting. There were 22% increase in evictions that took place.
Yeah, over 3 million apartments. We could do the math, but I'm just pointing out
It's
the graph
down
over
from
time.
historic levels. Yes.
So just while I'm speaking, I hope no one minds, I just have a question about the shelter. Where in this report is the shelter data? What page?
Towards the end.
Okay. So shelter accounts for 40% of expenses.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you meant homeless and shelter. It's
Sorry.
the very beginning.
I thought so.
It's pages 4 through 6,
Okay.
mostly page 5.
So shelter expenses, 40% of New York Metro. I realize that's not just Manhattan. And it increased by 5.6% in '24, following an increase of 5.8% in '23. But we're going to harp on rent-stabilized apartments, right? Because we knew what our increases were, and they outpace, we gave 2.7% last year, 5.6.
Well, the shelter is different than the rent. Shelter is,
What does go into?
yeah, so shelter is rent of primary residence and owner's equivalent of rent, which would be an estimate of how much it would cost to rent your house or your apartment unfurnished every month if you were to rent it out. So the actual rent portion went up 4.9%. The total shelter went up 5.6, because the owner's equivalent went up 6 something.
So we can just discount the owner's equivalent portion of that, because obviously that's not the population that we serve.
Yeah.
So it's the 4.6, isn't it?
Yeah, 4.9.
So it's a 4.6 number, which is higher than what the board gives. It's just a little misleading, right? That sort of says to me rent growth, 4 points.
But this is all,
This is
Metro.
this is the 20 million
Right.
people. This is the entire metro area.
Right.
It's New Jersey, it's Westchester,
and
it's Long
market rate,
Island.
rent stabilized,
Yeah.
affordable, whatever. It's everything.
Yes.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so I actually just had a follow-up on this discussion here on the eviction. So I'm just looking at the historic trend that was pointed out. So in the 2000s, the 2010s, we typically had 250,000 filings for non-payment of eviction every year. And, realized residential evictions were something like 25,000 a year. Whereas in the latest year, we've had less than 100,000 non-payment filings, and then, maybe 10,000, 15,000 evictions themselves. Whereas it seems like 16% of households are actually behind on their rent. So give or take, that's maybe 400,000 units that are behind payments, whereas evictions are being filed on, let's say, 100,000 of those units. So this is also a question for the lawyers in the room. What's going on? What's going on here? So yeah.
I can answer part of that. Okay. Well, in some of
I'll be
the,
curious to hear both of your
no,
answers. So
because
what-
I'm going to say, in some
Rob,
of the
you can-
boroughs, Brooklyn, Bronx, it takes longer for cases to get on the calendar and for cases to actually be litigated.
Facts.
So in Brooklyn. So if you file a non-payment action right now and you get an answer on that action, you're getting your court date the end of August, beginning of September.
With no rent in the
So-
intervening
Right,
months.
so what's and then that first court appearance is the access to justice, so the case is getting adjourned, so whereas you might have had for any specific tenant over time, maybe 2 non-payment cases, when court was really moving along I'm gonna say 2016, 2017, you might have had, after 1 month, 2 months, you had a case pending, then they paid, and then another case was commenced 5, 6 months later. You're not finding that now, my experience, because the cases are taking that much longer to get the money paid.
And
Would you mind, sorry, rephrasing your question in a thing, sort of like, what are you trying to get? The differences as opposed to like the non.
Yeah, I'm also curious about your math. What numbers did you put into that?
So basically what I'm getting at is it seems like many more non-payments are not resulting in non-payment eviction filings.
correct.
Because we see historically, we used to see 200,000, 250,000 every year non-payment filings, right? So that number is down enormously. Now we have less than 100,000 non-payment filings. Back to Rob's point, the non-payment calendared cases, those are also down. So even if there's court congestion, I'm just intrigued that the courts did process 125,000 eviction cases that were calendared on the dockets. The courts these days are doing less than half of that. And then that all translates to the final number of evictions that we see, which is, again, maybe half of what it was in the 2000s or 2010s. So one reason for the decline could have been, well, people are paying more of the rent. But back to your data that you presented, 16% of households appear to be behind on their rent. So my rough math is that maybe something like 400,000 units, rental units, that are behind payments. So of the 400,000 or so rental units that are behind payments, there are non-payment filings on maybe a fourth of those. So it just seems like there are not evictions being filed on many households
Yeah,
that
I
are
mean,
in fact behind
You're,
payments.
you're taking the numbers from the household pulse survey?
Right,
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, they asked, is there any point in the last year that you've been behind on rent? And then 34% of those people said, I'm still behind. So,
So some portion.
yeah, so
Up.
a lot of those people caught up eventually.
That's right. I mean, people miss rent payments and.
Yeah,
then
people
they
miss
catch
rent
up.
payments and then make it up,
And I
Right.
think a lot of landlords look at their arrears and they say, this person's behind 2 months. They generally pay on the 20th. They sort of weigh the cost of seeking that rent against a person who's like 2 months behind and what that could mean. They sort of weigh whether they're eventually going to get paid. I think that's an important point. They don't start a case on
Right.
2 missed months.
Sometimes.
Maybe. Sometimes.
Yeah. I think also part of that is if someone is receiving certain benefits, sometimes the payment of the benefits, it could come not in line with when rent is due, and so then it may appear as though someone is actually behind, but it's not the tenant's actual fault, and so that can lead to why it may look as though they're behind on month's rent, when in actually they're just waiting for
Yeah.
HRA payments to come in.
Oh.
I think the other thing too,
Yeah.
sorry.
Also, if you accepted an ERAP payment as a landlord, you agreed not to evict anybody for a year.
Yeah. And then I think the other thing too is, particularly with right to counsel happening in 2017 moving forward, right? Like a lot of advocacy can sometimes get done, as Rob mentioned, like if someone, let's say, was sued in non-payment before or has touched the system in a way before, there could be a scenario where advocates know what the situation is, and then you can deal with it with the adversary, the landlord or their attorneys, prior to actually a filing occurring. So that could be another reason.
Right, and the money ultimately gets paid.
Right. Let's add, I mean, half question, half comment. My understanding is that the household pulse survey is a very kind of experimental product from the
Yes.
Census Bureau, and, you know, there's likely very large kind of margin of error.
Yes,
bars
that's in the
of this.
report,
I
yes.
think one of the challenges here is which of these data are the most kind of, you know, reliable, clearest picture of what's happening in the low end of the rental housing stock. So I would put more, you know, emphasis on the actual eviction data than the pulse survey.
Which, by the way, I think it's done. They're not doing
Yeah.
it.
Yeah,
Oh.
it's done now,
So,
so.
It was experimental, maybe the experiment didn't go well.
Yeah.
In that regard, maybe it would be helpful as a follow-up, Danielle, because there are a number of different measures, I would say, of rent delinquency and housing instability. Evictions is one measure, filing's another measure. Some of the pulse surveys a measure. There's even HCR data that we have in the INE that sort of tries to measure rent payment levels. Maybe you could do a summary. This is a very complex issue. There is no clear data set that I know of that talks about rent delinquency across the board in this stock. I think we've all heard anecdotally that post-COVID it went up significantly, but I'm also hearing anecdotally it's getting better. And I don't know what that even means, honestly. I mean, I'm sure, Don, you have a thought on that. I'm sure Rob and Christine do as well. I think those who run housing have a thought on that. But to the extent that it could help us to get a picture, that might be helpful. Again, just the data. And acknowledging, I think Reed's point is a good one, which is some data sources are better than others. Some are more current than others.
So I have a separate question, and it has to do with employment numbers. So I saw that New York City added about the number of jobs increased by 2.2%. Yet unemployment was rising.
Yeah.
And so is that an account of like people having to work more than one job? And if that's the case, then do we have data about that? And I think we've asked maybe that prior years about double jobs, but I'm just curious.
I don't have an exact reason why it is. The numbers aren't directly comparable, though. The unemployment numbers is one survey where they ask people who live in New York City, are you working, are you not working, are you looking for work? The employment numbers are a separate survey where businesses are surveyed as to how many jobs they have added or lost. The employees may not live in New York City, yes.
And the other thing, I think, in this, you see this in the national numbers fairly regularly, because workforce participation is the other variable that goes into this. So even if employment goes up, if more people enter the workforce looking.
Yes.
You could have a case where unemployment goes up while employment's going up.
Yeah, or the population increases at a
Right.
different rate than,
Participation is
yeah,
greater.
yeah.
To that regard, on incomes, average income, so we're reporting that average incomes on a real basis, I think that's how I think of it, is down by 0.4%. Do you have that breakout by borough? Do we know by borough? I know that's not,
Yeah,
again,
I think it's in appendix.
is it in there? I'm sorry.
It's okay. Let me put my glasses on.
I mean, it's not a perfect, oh, I maybe didn't get to page 43, sorry.
It is appendix 4,
And how different it might be? 4?
yes.
Sorry.
But
okay.
this is people working in that borough, it's not people who live in that borough.
Okay, so it's by location of where the business is, where the job
Yes.
is, not by where they live. I
Yes.
see.
I think on page 43, it shows renter income by borough.
Well, so that's, would be household, this is wages, this is
Right,
what
I
you
was
make at
looking
your
at
job.
wages. Yeah, I was thinking about
That's household
wages.
income, so there's different ways to look
Yeah.
at it and different sources.
Yeah.
This data is very current, it goes through the third quarter of 2024, but it is based on what businesses are reporting.
Right. I mean, now that I'm looking at it, obviously no surprise, Manhattan is 2.5 times more any other borough. And I guess this is average real wages. But the Bronx is the second highest. Very, even, I mean, just even if it's the location of the jobs, not the location of the people, interesting.
It's a different picture on page 43, I think.
Right, that's the HVS data, right?
No, that's the ACS data, but it has the income by renter. So
Oh, that's more interesting. Yeah, that's more interesting. Yes, I agree.
So there, the Bronx is like half of that.
Which is what you would expect.
And that was a 0.4% decrease on top of a 1.8% decrease from last year too, right? 2020.
That sounds right.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
0.4 this year for sure, in
On top of the.
inflation
Yeah,
adjusted, yes.
in real terms, okay.
We talked about this a little, I think, last year with HPD when they came and presented the HVS data. But both the ACS, which is, again, metro area, and 2024 data. and
2023,
2023, I'm sorry, and the HVS, which is 2023 data, right? Or
except for incomes, which are 2022.
Right. Both show a reduction, again, this is generally, this is not specific to rent stabilized housing, of rent burdens.
There was a slight
Yeah.
0.1 percentage point in the ACS this year.
Right.
Much bigger decrease in the HVS.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think last year, if I remember, HPD, one of their explanations was that higher income people were moving into rent stabilized units.
Yeah, there's
said.
a larger discussion about that in last year's
Right.
Income and Affordability Study.
Right, and the ACS continues to show that trend. I know things are not comparable, Danielle, but I'm just trying to sort of churn out of this like some trends. So that's continuing?
I
We don't
can't
know.
say, I don't, the data that I'm pulling for the American Community Survey is just what they're publishing.
Right.
So,
Right, we don't know where it
Yeah.
comes from.
But it's interesting, Doug, because I actually was looking and I pulled up figure 17 from the HVS, which is that graph, which shows from 2021 to 23, renters who moved into vacant units, and that's the one that shows
Right.
that 56% of folks who moved into vacant units earn over $100,000. So, and HPD actually does say in the report that it's the replacement of lower earning tenants, so.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
So this is maybe a request that I think you could do with the ACS data, which is to report the renter burden calculation you have there by tenure, right? So in the ACS, there should be some indication for when the person has moved into the unit, how long they've lived in the unit, something like that. So this is, this will be subject to the caveat that this is not going to be just among rent stabilized units, of course. This will be among all renter households in the ACS in New York City. But maybe we could also stratify by borough. So if we had a sense for the city overall, and then for each borough, what renter burdens looked like, cutting by how long, tenure, and some reasonable dimension, whether the person has recently moved in, whether they've been there for a long time, that'll diagnose, some of these issues of how much is this improvement in the rent burden coming from just new entrants versus longstanding residents.
right, well, I'd have to look at the microdata for the ACS to see if they ask that. And then the other issue is that the microdata that is released, it's only like 2/3 of the households versus what they publish on their website, which is all of the households. So I don't know that, especially by borough, and then it's like you keep breaking it up.
Maybe just citywide then. But, if you have 2/3 of rental households in the ACS microdata, and then cutting by, some dimension of tenure. I know for sure there are definitely some dimensions of tenure in the ACS.
I think there's a measure of if someone moved in the last year.
Yes.
It should say how many years you've lived in the unit.
Is that what I think so?
Does it? Why don't we take a look at it, Danielle? I mean,
Yeah, I have to look
recognizing
at
that
it.
there may be some, again, it's not a perfect measure. There is no perfect measure, right? We're trying to use all this data to maybe triangulate to some sort of conclusions, which I think are challenging. But let's try. Any other? Yeah. go on.
So I have a question about the last week's report, unless there are any other questions about. So this is, and sorry, this has already been asked and answered previously, but this is in reference to the 2025 Income and Expense Study, and specifically page 29 of that report, which breaks out operating cost to income ratios by decile for this housing stock. So what we see in this table is that the top decile of the building stock, the top 10% of buildings, have an average cost to income ratio of 2.97, right?
Thank you.
So that would seem to indicate to me that at least 10% of buildings in New York City have costs that exceed income. However, your measure of distressed buildings comes out to less than 10%. And then even if I go down to the 90th percentile, i.e. the second to top decile, that is a ratio of 0.99. So again, that would, if I'm just reading this table, my takeaway would be that about 20% of the buildings in New York City should have costs that exceed income. But your calculation of distressed buildings, which does it like building by building, comes at a number that's like a little less than 10% or around 10%.
I'm sorry, I didn't have a copy of the report right away, but the 90th percentile is at 0.99 for citywide, so that would seem to, so anything above 1.0 would be considered distressed, I believe. And this is calculated by Department of Finance, not by us. So it seems to correspond if you're talking the above the 90th decile.
I guess it's just an interpretation of what that 100% number means. So is that the top decile of the building stock, or is that the absolute max of?
I believe because it starts at 10%, I believe it's 90 to 100% in that category.
In the very top category.
I assume so, because it's 10 to 100%.
So if this is just a clarification thing. So I just want to know what the 100% number means there in that column, because if that's the top 10% of buildings, then it seems like there's another 10% of buildings immediately below it in the 90% category that should also have, they should have a cost to income ratio of 0.99. The top one should have a ratio of 2.97. So adding those two together, I would expect a distressed building count of around 20%, but your count is like 10%.
I mean, at .99, technically, it wouldn't be considered distressed as, based on the definition that we give, or that's provided by finance, so that might explain why it might be around 10%.
Maybe, because this is some, Andrew and I were talking a little earlier, sidebar, about some questions we have at the Department of Finance. Maybe this, even though, because I know this data is finance data, maybe we can just ask them to clarify to the extent because it is a good question to ask. So let's add that to our finance list, Andrew.
Okay.
The decile.
Okay. But that's, even if in that 90%, they're paying less than that 0.99. Half, because that's like the percentile would be that.
Is that the ceiling or the median?
median.
The median. So then
Right, so it's
some
still
portion
not
paying
all
more
of
and
that
some.
90 percentile, but because the median, it's what they're saying at the 50% decile. Half the people are, half the owners are paying less than 69 cents on a dollar in operating costs, and 50% are paying more than that, 69. So I think you would read that the same way, and the 0.99. So it may not be 20%, but there is more of that group that may be in the distress because they're paying above the 0.99.
And I think your point is
I
that
think
that
that's-
seems inconsistent with the measure of slightly less than 10%. So it's really just trying to establish the definitions in this chart, I think is the
Okay.
question. So let's do that as a follow-up if we can, Brian. Okay, any other questions?
Just on the answers to our questions from
Yeah.
last time,
Yeah.
on page 4 of the answers, just that for the 374 buildings, the count rising, but the portion distressed falling. But I don't believe we've built any 1973, 1974 buildings like that. So I'm just curious.
I have same question.
That's a good, yeah, and that was brought up by others. There seems to be, the way you did the math is off of this year's data, but there's 1,000 new buildings or more in this year's data that was set, that weren't in last year's data set for fiscal year. But how can that be? Right? When you look at just the data sets.
I'm sorry, I don't have a copy of the memo
Yeah.
with me, but you're comparing it to last year to this year? Did you say?
Yeah.
I mean, there's more buildings in the data set that was provided. It's not an absolute count of buildings, it's just based on what the RPIE filings are, and also based on the DHCR registration list, and more buildings have been registering in recent years.
So
because of-
it's an improvement in data collection.
Yes.
Yeah, because there's obviously not more buildings in the pre-74
Right.
category.
Yeah, so it's been
landlords are
increasing for
more-
several years, yeah,
So
and especially.
more likely to be doing those
Yeah.
filings.
I mean, there's been,
years.
I mean, just the
That's-
DHCR numbers have increased,
That's interesting.
and then finance matches them.
So is there any way, maybe this is a follow-up question on question number 4 here, is there any way for us to discern, is the number of buildings in distress increasing, or is the data getting better?
Right, yeah, the absolute number of distressed buildings, really, you can't look at, you look at the proportion of distressed buildings compared to the total number of buildings. So that's probably the best thing to look at, rather than the absolute number of distressed buildings in each, reported in the appendices.
Right, from that, one could at least posit that the increased data is resulting in a lower percentage of distressed buildings, but that the number of buildings in distress isn't going down. The absolute number of buildings.
Yeah, I'd have to look, you have to look at prior year's reports.
I mean, we did take a look, I think one of the questions was about that decile data over time. Looked like it stayed pretty constant, so.
That's in the memo, right, yeah.
It wasn't, yeah, exactly. I was worried about buildings moving, call it north. And that didn't appear to be the case, though I think our next speaker might have some things to say on this. Other? Okay. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Danielle. I don't know where Danielle went. With that, I want to welcome Mark Willis. This group, we have, strength. We'll plow through it.
So Reed, since you don't have it physically in front of you, I can say one of the last slides in our appendix answers your question.
Great.
Using their data. At least the best we could come up with. So if that
Yeah.
keeps you awake for the whole.
Mark, shall I do your, shall I do your bio?
Whatever you want.
I guess that's what
Some
Andrew's
some
telling me.
folks know me, but I don't know everybody.
I've known Mark for a while, so I just ignore his bio. Mark is now, I know he's at the Furman Center. I guess you're a visiting fellow? A program
No, I'm the.
Senior
senior.
fellow?
Right.
You're a fellow.
Right.
But Mark was previously, has a really impressive background, a visiting scholar at the Ford Foundation. He was at 19 years at JP Morgan Bank, executive VP for Chase Community Development Corp. I think I first met Mark when he was Deputy Commissioner of Development at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And he's been at Furman Center for a number of years. So welcome, Mark. Thank you for coming today.
Now it is, it works. So the red in this one is on. That's okay. That's a challenge. Oh, okay, it's going to be over here? All right. So let me just, before I start the formal presentation, just thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be here. I know we all share a concern about the shortage of affordable housing. We just need more housing, and we need to preserve what we have. So my presentation is all about preservation. It's a work in progress. We're trying to understand all the implications, intended and unintended, from the passage of HSTPA, as you all know, is the 2019 rent reform legislation. The importance of preserving housing that's affordable, again, both what we say privately owned and subsidized. There are private owners of subsidized, so the language is a little complicated, but I think you get the point of what I'm going to talk about. There are lots of anecdotes that seem on their face to contradict each other. And there are lots of data challenges. You'll hear me talk about some of them when I make this presentation. But we've really dived in here into the data that's available to try and come up with, I'll call it a consistent understanding of what is going on there. If there's a lesson for the Rent Guidelines Board, other than my sympathy, and you'll see why I say that, I think there's more analysis that can be done. There are lots of restrictions on who gives what data out, HCR, DOF, Department of Finance, but I think there are more opportunities here. And most importantly, this is a work in progress, as I said, so I'm looking forward very much to questions, suggestions, any thoughts you have when we're done. So let's just see whether this is going to work. There we go. So as a quick outline here, what did HSTPA change? Just establish a basis of understanding that. What remains the same? The dilemma you all face in setting rent increases, reason for my choice of the word sympathy. The need for analysis focused more on buildings that seem most at risk. I'm going to talk about what I think are the buildings most at risk. Some early data we have suggesting a decline in expenditures on maintenance and operations, and concluding remarks. So I don't mind if there's a technical question, you just want to stop me to understand something. This is pretty complicated. I'm going to try and stay at a level that gets me through, and I don't know what my time limit is, but some reasonable amount of time, so we have time to talk at the end.
That'd be helpful.
I'm Mark Willis at the Furman Center. The title is obvious, HTPA and the challenges of preserving New York City's unsubsidized and subsidized affordable housing stock. Let's get started. Oh, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. So what has changed and what has not? So what has changed dramatically here, and I can't emphasize this enough, is in 2019, the rent stabilization law changed hugely. And what it did is it greatly restricted the ability of landlords And in this case, landlords of subsidized and unsubsidized property to be able to raise the rents on their rent-stabilized units. And there's no longer vacancy allowance, there's no longer overly generous, my choice of term, you can choose whatever you want, very generous MCIs and IIs, which not only, which also help improve the ability to operate the building, not just to do capital improvements. I'm not going to talk about MCIs, I'm not talking about IEIs in this conversation. It's all about the ability to operate, sustainably operate a rental property. So the increases, and getting an idea of what the focus is, on 100% rent-stabilized properties are almost completely circumscribed by what the Rent Guidelines Board does. So, and when I say 100%, you'll see in some cases it's 76 to 100, sometimes I'll talk to 90 to 100%. If you saw the distribution here, you'd know that the vast majority of properties between 76, buildings between 76 and 100%, the vast majority of the buildings and the units are in 95 to 100, certainly 90 to 100%. So the distribution is very weighted towards the 100% end. So I'll sometimes use the word language 100%. I'm really referring to those that are basically at 100%. What hasn't changed, and this is really fundamental to this conversation, is that in order for a landlord who wants to operate the building on a sustainable basis, needs rents to go up enough to cover increase in operating costs, and enough to maintain what's called NOI, the net operating income, constant in real terms. And we can talk some more about why that's the case, but NOI does a lot of things, provides a return, pays debt service, it's used by banks to judge whether they can make a loan, what size of the loan can be. So preserving that is essential. And owners, if they are, NOI isn't staying constant, the value of the building is falling. And you can imagine what the incentives then are to keep putting in more equity. So the long-run financial sustainability requires that rental income be allowed to increase sufficiently to cover any increases in operating costs and to preserve the value of the remaining income in inflation-adjusted dollars. And we'll talk about the subsidized stock. In some ways is even more extreme in that because they are leveraged to the hilt, and NOI decreasing causes problems in terms of meeting lending covenants. So having set that up, let's just
Mark, excuse me.
go forward.
Just as a matter.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
you just have to yell because I'm looking that way.
No worries. Just on the previous slide, in terms of, since you said we could stop for technical sort of clarification, I just want to note that this third bullet point where it says, I'm sorry, the first bullet point where they said that no longer allowed our vacancy allowances or MCIs and IAIs.
Right.
It's not that they're done away with. It's just a matter of the fact that there's limitations on the MCIs and IAIs, which even last year, due to legislative changes, there was clawbacks from the HSTPA in terms of the amount of IAIs that can be recouped. So I just want to clarify for the board's sake that it's not that the RGB increases are the only way to increase a rent. It was just that there was restrictions placed on from the 2019 laws.
Obviously, you are correct. The point here is I'm not talking about MCIs and IIs, but previously, MCI and IIs, the amount of increase that was allowed did help you on the operating side, not just to do the capital.
Absolutely. I just wanted to clarify for everyone else.
No, that's great. No, but it's an extremely important point. So thank you for making that. So your decision-making process is complicated by inflation, right? And how did I come to that conclusion? Well, the state legislation, as you know, requires you to reconcile 5 goals. 2 key ones I'm going to talk about here. One is preserving affordability by protecting tenants from speculative rent increases resulting from excess market demand. Sorry for the economist language there, but I think that, to me, explains the motivation here for what the legislation wanted to do. It also has, talks about enabling the financial sustainability so that owners can properly maintain and operate their rent-stabilized units. sometimes referred to as providing a fair return, lots of litigation over that. We can debate what that is. But the idea here is obviously you do not want to discourage somebody who wants to maintain their building well from being able to do it. So that's what I call about financial sustainability. We're not talking about making it a great investment. We're not talking about speculative increases. We're just talking about what does it take to operate that building year over year, and am I going to have enough rent to be able to do this? So in a world of no inflation, that is zero rent increase, in a world of no inflation, no increase in operating costs, no increase in general inflation, I think the decision, I may be simplifying, would be relatively easy. Zero rent increases, right? But when you put inflation on the table here, it puts these two goals in tension, because there obviously are tenants whose incomes aren't going up at the rate of inflation. And so you hear people ask for zero rent increases. And then there are the arguments from the reality of operating these buildings. And you hear lots of anecdotes here about that. But in your job, I don't want to presume I know, but if I were sitting in a seat, how do I compromise? What's the right level in between in terms of rent increases? Inevitably, that rent increase is below what is needed to cover operating costs, increase in operating costs, and increase in inflation. So just to get a little sense of this, we could pick many different time periods. We can talk about this, but we just picked 2010 to 2023. As you know, your I&E data is, most recent is 2023, so I'm referring to the RPIE fact behind it. And you can see that the one-year increases, I'm not going to get into the two-year and how these things relate, which in itself is a fascinating discussion, have gone up on average at 1.68. We call it compounded annual growth rate. Right, so when I'm talking about average, I'm not just averaging the increases. I'm doing it in this way called compounded annual growth rate. Metro New York CPI, we are looking at the CPI here in this area, not the national, went up at 2.3% a year. We're trying to figure out for the properties we're most interested, where I can find the data in the RGB RPIE work, and we looked at the Bronx average, so operating costs. Assuming that operating cost, which is lots of reasons to think, in fact, it isn't even adequate, but assuming it was adequate to properly maintain the buildings, it went up over this period of time 3.05%. And then the difference, and that's what I call the rent shortfall, interestingly enough, in the math, is exactly 1.00. So every year, over this period of time, the RGB's increases, just to make the point, have not kept up with operating costs, CPI, and most important, if you assume operating costs were 50% of the revenue, just to make it easy math, overall, the increases were 1 percentage point short. So from 2.68 to 1.68. So let's just we can also look at the actual data here. So we started with a base rent of $1,027, which is the Bronx pre-47, 2018 average rent per unit. I'll just mention here the change from 47 to pre-47 to pre-74. I will mention when that is something you should just be aware of. So it can affect the data because it's a subset of the stock, but some cases we ignore that because we don't see a discontinuity. But here, 1,027 going up at the one-year increases by 2024 would be $1,142 a month. The growth CPI, so we just assumed if operating costs went up the same as general inflation, then we can just look at CPI in general. And we've made the argument just that CPI is probably a good, over the very long run, proxy for the increase in operating costs. Obviously, today, we could talk about insurance, and other years we talk about fuel costs going up and down, but in the long run, maybe CPI is right, but we just used it. It may be too low, as you saw in the previous one, if actual operating costs to properly maintain the building went up faster. So by 2024, the monthly shortfall per unit is $120, which on an annual basis is 1 month's rent, in excess of 1 month's rent. So the lesson from this is these shortfalls are significant and they grow exponentially. And I will keep coming back to that problem. So this is a page for anybody who wants it, but I'm not going to go through it. It basically just tells you how we pick that data and why we pick the data. But as a researcher, I can't resist totally from giving you that information. So what are we really worried about? We're worried about the 100% rent stabilized stock, the scale of which is very significant. And it is the source of major source of affordable housing in the city. And I use affordable housing for housing that's affordable, not just subsidized. So we estimate about 200,000 privately owned rent units are likely already in significant stress and likely to be much more. We'll give some evidence of that later on. So we've actually tried to use the DOF data. We don't have HCR data. We don't have what HPD does. Scrape the DOF data, which, as was pointed out before, has gotten seems to be getting better now that there are penalties for not registering. So we're going to continue updating this. But of the total number we were able to do a few years ago, again, we'll update it as soon as we can in June. There are about 400,000 units are in pre-74, 76 to 100% rent-stabilized buildings. If we further impose and say, all right, some of those have very high rents for a number of reasons we can talk about, why don't we just look at the number of properties that are below the median rent for that, which is about 1,200, we'll talk about it. Then we're about 200,000 units. So in the private stock of those buildings that are most affected by HSTPA, our estimate is about 200,000. In addition to that, which surprises a lot of people here, is the subsidized rent stabilized stock. So almost all of the 100% affordable housing that the city has built over the last whatever, so the existing, we get an estimate from them that there are about 300,000 units that are subject to regulatory agreements that specify the rent increase is the lower of our Rent Guidelines Board increase or the AMI cap. I can explain what the AMI cap is, but for purposes here, in most cases today, the rent stabilization guidelines are binding. So AMI cap doesn't really matter. What really matters is what you can do under the rent guidelines law.
Mark?
So,
Mark, can I just?
Absolutely.
One clarifying question on the prior
Absolutely.
slide? I mean, this has come up in past conversations. Is it fair then to say that you're saying about 500,000 units are the ones that you're focused on, which is about half of the rent stabilized stock? Is that a fair statement? I look at you. And
yeah, of the million? Yeah, right. Yes, yeah. Most people don't cut it that way, but that's exactly right. Right, because people don't realize how much of this, of the subsidized stock is rent stabilized. And I think shows up in your data. I mean, Andrew can straighten me out, but I think that is in there because you look at buildings that have as few as, my choice of term, one rent stabilized unit. So I assume if it's subsidized and it has a rent stabilized unit, they have to register. It is registered. That's what's required in the regulatory agreement. I suspect that it's there. That's what, right. Huh?
Units, HPD, subsidized.
Right.
Is that correct, Dan?
That it's in our data and the RTI, yes.
Yeah, that was. I was just
The 100%, I mean, there were LIHTC, doesn't have to be 100%.
right.
So, but most of them are now, right? Everything
not
has a
be-
nuance, Alex, I'm sorry. But that's a good question.
Yeah, okay.
Okay? So the scale is immense. Preserving this stock is the reason I'm here, because I just think it's too important. And let me just point out, for better or worse, a new unit costs 500 to 700,000 units, not dollars, I'm sorry, right? If, as somebody said, that if the analog is a bathtub full of water, right, we can try and close a drain, or we can try and add more units at the top at a very high price. So I think we as policymakers are facing a very important set of choices here.
So can I,
Oh,
before you
again,
leave, I'm
sure.
sorry, I'm sorry.
No,
Brian,
we have
just-
time, until you kick me out.
Yeah, well, we'll do that too.
Thank you, Doug.
But isn't the NOI, I know NOI is only one of the measures you look at, but
Right.
it is one. On a affordable unit with a regulatory agreement, there's a different set of calculations. I mean, that debt may be not being paid or may be deferred. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different, more complicated issues on the affordable.
I can go,
Maybe I'm going too,
you could, but
Jumping forward.
it's such an important point. So an affordable housing, by
this
this,
is in the operating on both sides.
Doug?
Yes,
The affordable, development of affordable housing that's subsidized
Yes.
is leveraged to the hilt.
yes,
And that leverage depends on debt service coverage,
right.
which depends on the size of the NOI. So if NOI is decreasing, this is a huge problem there. It is different in detail, but not in substance, as to the effect this has on the ability to preserve this property and maybe even to build it in the first place.
Right, okay.
Yeah, can I just follow up on this point? So we had done a survey at the board ourselves on the frequency by which buildings, the rent stabilized stock, have leverage, right? Andrew can refresh me on the details. I've forgotten all of them. But I think the main conclusion that I remember drawing from that is I was surprised by how little leverage there actually was in our survey estimate of the building stock. This was,
Right, stay tuned. Right, absolutely. Is there a question with that? Because that's a very important point.
well, what you just said, that these buildings are leveraged to the hilt.
I said they're
Our-
subsidized. They're subsidized by definition when they are developed fully. So the
So it's
300,000.
really that 300,000
That's right.
subsidized rent stabilized
Right.
units that are.
Doug was asking whether there's a difference between the subsidized and the unsubsidized. There is. But in the end, NOI matters in both, just for different reasons.
Right, because just to finish this thought,
I'm sorry.
believe what we had found is that it was particularly smaller building owners that were less likely to be leveraged. And it was they're
Mm-hmm. Right.
for the more institutional,
Right.
larger.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if that relates also to this distinction you're drawing between that 200,000 and the 300,000 privately owned versus subsidized rent stabilized units. Is the reason for this leverage to the hilt phenomenon the fact that this 300,000 is more, larger building owners, they're more likely to have leverage?
So if it helps, I think leverage is the most important part for the 300,000. For the 200,000, it is if NOI falls, the value of my building is going to fall. So whether I have any loan or not, the value will fall as NOI falls, right? And so am I going to put more money into a building that is destined, because of this law, over time to fall in value? So I agree with you. There are different motivations because there's different way of financing. I'd also say on the subsidized, the city and state could change their programs. They could eliminate the rent stabilization restriction, or they could promise every affordable housing development that we will subsidize this gap every year. You can imagine what the cost of that would be. So we're a little bit in the weeds,
Okay.
but I think usefully there in that the problem exists on both sides, even if the way it will show up might be different. So So we've mined the Department of Finance NOPV data, right? So this is if you live in the city, notice of proposed valuation you get in January. We've, kind of massaged it a little bit, so it doesn't, I know Department of Finance uses the RPIE, so at the core, RPIE is here, but we can distinguish whatever categories what. We don't have the discontinuity problem, whatever. So what we found if you look at, going from left to right, the least rent stabilized buildings, what's happened? Middle income, the middle ones, which are ones that were in the process of being vacancy decontrolling of units. The ones to the right that didn't get very far are odd at all. Again, we could focus on Bronx buildings that are literally at 90 to 100%, so we can narrow down to try and find data on the key areas of interest for us. And then if we look at the 90 to 100% rent stabilized buildings that are, the average rent in the building is below the median for those buildings. And you see something very dramatic. So the kind of data you get in the I&E is columns 1, 2, and 3 combined. And to the extent you look at different categories, you'd break it a little bit differently, 80%, 50%, whatever. You can see you can move from, let's say expenses, 5.21% increase between 2019 and 2023, right? Increased by 5.21%. The middle ones that are partially decontrolled, 1.23%. The ones that are barely or not at all of a sudden we're seeing something a little different. Expenses decrease. These are in real terms, by the way. And a 76, and then when you look at just the Bronx, 90 to 100, as if, there's more, the 90 to 100 are more representative of what's going on out there. It's a decline. And if you look at those that have not ever been able to raise their rents very much under rent stabilization, so they didn't maybe take J51, they didn't take MCIs, IIs, they didn't, or they did and the market didn't allow them to raise it. All of a sudden you see what we think is the dramatic news that is most representative of what we think the 200,000 units citywide are facing. So very huge decrease here. Your data, we're going to suggest you need to dive in more into this data, right? That requires, I know, you to go to DOF. I don't know all the complications of doing that, but if you look across here, gross income, 3.2%, 3.22 on the left, minus 3.8. Expenses, 5.21, down 6.86. NOI, interesting enough, goes up very slightly. Doesn't really mean very much. Percentages, in these buildings, actually to Arpit's point, the NOI is very small because costs are such a high percentage, expenses are such a high percentage of operating the buildings. So I don't know exactly what to say about NOI going up. It's very minor, and it wouldn't offset the expenses.
What do you think is the cost to income of that right in those properties?
Well, we'll talk about that. But you have your own data. Actually, I can skip ahead here. The top two deciles show over 1 for the Bronx. If you combine Appendix 7 and 7.9, you'll see big jump in the percent of buildings that are distressed, that is where income is less than operating expenses.
Are you implying that the RGB should make a decision to increase rents on folks in the Bronx because to some level that like the market would bear? The market can't bear that in the Bronx. Like folks' income can't bear that. I don't understand.
No, not. I think I acknowledged before. Your job is to do both. I'm explaining the other side.
Right.
Right, and this is just you might call this is an unintended consequence. I don't think anybody out there, I won't say anybody, but I can't speak for all of them, is looking to see these buildings decline secularly over time.
Mark, what is
I know.
PT?
So I'm giving the economic reality
Right.
of where we are.
And I understand that since 2019, it's just also difficult to reconcile when the Bronx's NOI has been up 35% since, 35 or 38, I think, since 1990, and NOI generally across the city has been up 40%.
If there's any point I want to make about this, is I can't say what was done fairly before. I can just tell you what trajectory we're on now, right? And 2019, as I said at the very beginning, marked a major change. So we can talk all day about what happened before. There are some owners that benefited or not before 2019. There's some owners who bought in 2019, and they have whatever data or whatever they have based on what they thought the value of 2018. I don't think they bought in 2019. So this is the best data we probably have to try and focus in on those 200,000 properties and what is likely to be happening here. So. And just interestingly, since people want to know, property taxes are actually gone down in real terms for these properties.
I think Alex, you had a, yeah. Okay. Just back to that.
I'm going to present a little more data.
Okay, why don't you do that, and then we can ask more.
Right? So I did look at the cost-to-income ratios for the highest deciles. Just the summary, that's that chart 7, appendix 7. So we've had some discussions. You could probably get a sense that we have as to exactly what that data is. But I think at a high level, this is the case. So the highest income if the ratio gets to 1 or over 1, obviously you have no money beyond, you might even not even have money for all your operating expenses. So from 2018 to 2023, expenditure costs for rent-stabilized buildings increased as a percentage of income for the top 7 deciles, which pushes down NOI. At the 80 to 90%, as was noted before, the Bronx ratio grew over the same period to 1.04 from 0.93. Over the same period, the citywide ratio grew to 9.99, just short of 1. You heard all this. And in both cases, the 90 to 100% decimal was in excess of 1. It's got some oddball stuff in it, presumably, right? So I don't know exactly what they cleaned out or not, but in the top deciles, there's some pretty high numbers. Just because you asked, this is what's happened to this is combining appendices 7 and 9, because 7 and 9 tells you the actual numbers. You can see that the percent of buildings over 1, I don't know why, can I lower this? No, I just want to make sure. So there it is. The recent rapid rise in the Bronx and the percentage of pre-74 rent-stabilized buildings that are in distress compared to citywide. So the blue is the Bronx, and you can see it's gone up dramatically since 2018, up to 13.31% of whatever that is.
May I
So the
ask-
percent is not dependent on the number, it's dependent on the proportion. Anyway.
I just have a clarifying question, Mark, sorry.
Yeah, right.
Is there, in this presentation, is there going to be some delineation or accounting for COVID in this too?
Yeah, no.
Okay, I'm just checking.
First of all, that's an excellent question. So we have tried, we've tried to separate out the most difficult part of this analysis is the intervention of the pandemic, right? So we try to look at the Bronx relative to the city, because the city, we assume that's the pandemic, and the Bronx, if it has something incremental over that, may be due to this problem that the Bronx has the most 100% rent-stabilized buildings. Okay, so concluding observations, rent shortfall has likely grown since HSTPA. my choice of term to say likely, but I think seems pretty clear, and will continue to grow, potentially exponentially, in 100% rent-stabilized buildings. That is, this is not a cyclical thing. This is not each year by itself. As the gap increases every year, it compounds with the previous year's gap. I think you saw that in the earlier table. To preserve the long-term viability of the most vulnerable subsegments of the stock, the shortfall may need to be dealt with outside of the RGB process. This is a large-scale problem. Simply filling the gap with public subsidy could be very expensive over the long run. So I left off of here the importance of getting better data, more focused on whatever subsect you want, but something probably would look like 200,000 units. I think it is, from a policy-making point of view, the highest priority we need right now. So we can really understand and not look at data that includes, as I said, buildings of all different levels of rent stabilization and all different levels of rent, and all different levels of, do they have commercial, and should you think about commercial? They have other income. So all of those things need a really good look because, as I said, and I'll end with this, preserving this stock could not be any more important than I've laid out here, right? We need our affordable stock. We can't afford, literally, to lose it or to see it decline significantly in quality in the meantime. So, Doug, that concludes my remarks.
Thank you. I'm going to open up for questions. I'm sure there are some, Mark. I have a few, but I'll let others go first. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. Yes.
Alex.
Hi, Mark, thanks for this. I was comparing the last year's and this year's income and expense study, looking at longitudinal data
Right.
for the Bronx.
Right.
And this year's data shows improvement. So, for example, last year, NOI in the Bronx,
Right.
Went down by 14%, but mostly that was post-1974 buildings, 1.3% overall. For reverse that. It went down by like 18% for pre-1974 buildings last year, a big decrease. That was in 2021 to 2022. Last year, the decrease was, it actually increased by 0.8%, going 0.1% for pre-1974. So there was an improvement in terms of NOI, and also costs, the rate of increase of costs improved last year. So you're showing a story of cumulative decline, and what this data seems to me is showing that there are some changes, and it reflects, I think, changes in the allowable rents.
I chose not to show the year over year, but we could do that. I'd be happy to sit down, and it's not inconsistent
The reason I'm
with
saying-
this. A data point. Just year over year, particularly with the pandemic coming out of it. Remember, this is 22 to 23. This is not today. So, to me, there's nothing inconsistent about the story that you're getting there. I think this is the right question, but we could sit and talk about it. You got to remember, you gave a 3.5% increase in rents back then as well, a 3.25% in rents.
The reason I'm raising this is that you were, if I understand correctly, you were saying that it's an exponential deterioration. And when I look at this data, it seems like somewhat.
So I didn't put in here, Alice, showing the expenditure. You can look at your own expenditures. In the Bronx, pre-74, I believe, yes, every set of data you have has different things. But yes, pre-74 Bronx data, the amount of money spent on maintenance has taken a huge dive. Make your own conclusions, right? Insurance costs have gone up a huge amount. Your own research in the past has shown that during recessions, when owners income is constrained, they cut back on costs. So sorting all that out, particularly with a pandemic, is very hard to do. So we looked at the year over year. I have that data. I'll be happy to share it. It showed, I didn't want to show it because I don't think that's the best way to measure it. But we can show using the NOPV data here. This is not, it's not because we picked 2 endpoints, right? The full evidence is this is, again, a secular problem, a long-term problem.
The other chart you showed was from our data?
Sorry?
The longitudinal chart was from our data?
Which one? No, this is the NOPV. This is Department of Finance.
It showed distress going up in the Bronx, far ahead of citywide.
Yeah, it was your RPIE data, right. It was the 2025 I&E report. This is the only place we have the breakdown by components. And it's in real terms. I see Andrew's looking at me. In real terms.
Yeah,
Right.
just to kind of follow up on this point, so I think one of the things I learned from this presentation, which I hadn't thought sufficiently before, is that minus 6.86 number you have on this slide. And I think that's a decline in expenses. So I think, back to Alex's point, I think one of the things this is suggesting is that while we think about NOI as our metric of building health, to the extent that there's deferred maintenance or delayed maintenance, that's going to artificially make buildings look more viable, when instead what's just kind of going on is a slow-running deterioration.
Yeah, right.
Right. So I'm just wondering and obviously one way we have to diagnose this is looking at the violations and other measures from HPD. You have thoughts on that, but I'm just wondering about other ways to diagnose how large a gap this would be if this is work that we could do on the board or you could do and send to us.
Right.
Like, for example, what if I just took this 90 to 100% segment or, one of the other segments to the right and just like fixed the cost to income ratio, like in 2019 or something, right? So if you just assume that the maintenance should be a certain percentage of the cost, it shouldn't decline the way it has, and then compute like what would NOI have been were you to keep your maintenance costs more fixed,
Right.
assuming a more regular period of kind of capital maintenance and so forth.
I'd be happy to work with you on
And
it.
then what would the NOI distribution,
Right.
what would the distressed fraction be were this maintenance term more constant over time, right? That would provide like an alternate measure of distress, which is like how much distress would you expect to see
Right.
if maintenance were flat versus how much distress do we
Right.
currently see?
Right.
That would maybe diagnose like how much distress are we
Right.
avoiding seeing in our data
Right.
just because buildings are cutting back on
Right.
maintenance.
You could ask DOF to break things down so that you would have the data to do that. We do not have that data. Right. There are such things as, no, we don't have the breakdown by costs, by the specific maintenance. We could just look, as you said, at the general ratios, but we don't, what happened to insurance costs? What happened year on year of fuel? We don't have, right? DOF does, and you can have them do it for this set of properties, right?
You could pick a point in time.
Which I completely agree. And just by the way, the state legislation, HSTPA, called for the state to monitor this, to do a study in 5 years. We're at 5 years plus. We had the pandemic in the meantime. I would just tell you, ARPIT, the complaints and code violations and stuff, it's all messed up. I mean, people didn't want anybody coming to the house during the pandemic, so violations, complaints fell dramatically. What's the right level? We looked at alteration permits, and since 2018, alteration permits have increased for all properties, presumably because there are a lot more requirements, but they increased much more for the increase much, let me put the other way, much less for the category we're talking about. To the extent we can look at the 76 to 100%, the increase in alterations is very modest compared to how much is being done in the rest. So it's very hard to tell what the amount of money that needs to be spent to properly maintain these buildings. Because as an economist here, you can look at the cost components, which I think the PR probably does a good job of, then you gotta, where's the efficiency? Where's the productivity gains, right? And then when you look at the individual components, what does the owner have control over? They don't have control over insurance, water and sewer, property taxes, which I think is much less concern for these small properties, for this, the 90 to 100% properties, I didn't mean small. They don't have control over what permits or whatever. So there's certain things are set for them, and then what they actually have flexibility over is what will maintain these buildings over time. And I think there's reasons to be quite concerned about what's already happening. I can repeat anecdotes. All of you should just talk to your friends, if you know anybody who's in the real estate business. And I've had shocking things like, yeah, we just build new affordable and we're just deferring maintenance. I said, to when? Right? So I would hope we don't wait 10 years till we actually start to see more general visibility. I mean, you have stories in the newspaper, the 97%, that's kind of a bizarre thing. We have claims by the apartment association about what's going on. We don't have data on any of those. So for them to really become visible could take a long time. It'd be pretty late if we wait that long to deal with it. And the city, unless we vastly increase the amount of budget for subsidized housing, almost all of it's going to have to be going to rescuing these buildings. So we won't be building any new ones in the future either. That would be the risk. So you can see why I'm treating this very
There's other
seriously.
questions. You have-
Right?
And I was just wondering, are we going to get a copy of this?
I
Sure.
would hope so.
Yeah, okay, that would be
Well,
helpful.
since it's video, we can make it easier.
Yeah, but the paper always helps me.
Right,
I'd like
right,
to have a
right.
copy of this so
Yeah,
that I can fully
absolutely.
parse.
No,
through
and
this.
please.
And for sure, and I also just want to say, I mean, I'm sure there's several other issues that once I sit with it, I can fully parse out. But I mean, this also makes the assumption that we're just talking about Bronx owners in 100% rent stabilized units, while in reality, those same owners are likely owners in other buildings. It's more about portfolios than about.
You missed the point.
No, I'm not missing the point. I'm just merely stating, right? Like,
Right.
Just Fix has data that shows like 56% of owners in core Manhattan also own buildings in other boroughs, right? So I'm just saying, I think we need to be looking at portfolios and not merely just individual owners. That's for a separate day.
Right.
I also do want to go on the record and say this. I think that procedurally, I disagree fundamentally with us having this presentation today, because I do think it detracts from what information we were presented, both in the I&E study 2 weeks ago, as well as the income and affordability study, because this is not about income and affordability today. And so as a matter of procedure, I think that it's inappropriate. And considering we don't have someone else here to directly provide, I'll say a separate view in real time of what's being presented, I think process-wise, I disagree with that. So I'm just going to go on the record and say that.
Fair. I mean, we were hoping actually to have Columbia come today, because I agree with you, that would have been a more companion, but they weren't able to. So that was part of the challenge is the scheduling. But I understand.
For sure. And to that, I would just say that even if Columbia had come today, I think they're not necessarily the folks who would be best situated or equipped to respond to this. Because they're talking about poverty.
No, I would have
trackers
had Mark come today.
Yeah, right. So maybe someone from AHD or someone from a different
Open to,
organization.
and we still have several more meetings, and I want to encourage something you and I have to talk about, other voices to come. And, if we have to even add, Andrew probably yell at me, but if we have to add another public meeting like this to make sure we get every voice heard, I'm very open to that. But let me kind of, to the one point, I had a couple questions, but the one point Don was making, we are talking here about that portion of the stock, to call it 200,000 units. If you did this for the rest of the stock, sort of split out as Andrew normally would.
So the way we've thought about it is, and these are the ones of most immediate concern. This is affecting everybody, right?
Well, it's
So-
affecting everybody in
who-
those units and those owners in those units.
Right.
Our
Right.
purview, as you know, is much broader.
No.
And it gets to a question that we struggle with. You acknowledged at the beginning of the struggle. Actually, the struggle is twofold. One is what you laid out. The other is that, are we making decisions on what I will call the median unit or the unit that's
Right.
at the lowest end of the spectrum?
Right, right.
And that's a really complicated challenge. So
It
you're
is.
focused on that, and I
Right.
appreciate that, and I
Right.
agree with you
Right.
from a broader policy perspective.
Right,
But our role is setting rent.
right.
If you looked at this for the other segments, I would be curious if you have that data and could share that with us as well.
Well, to the extent that there's the 1 to 25% and the 26 to
So
71.
that's all, so those are
Those are
all the
all.
units in those categories.
That's right, all the
Got it.
pre-74.
So if I look
right.
at 1 to 25, is this all units or just Bronx units?
No, they're all units.
I see. So
Right,
the only
but-
category that's Bronx only are the last two columns?
That's right, right. I just want to make the point of the Bronx is not because I just care about the Bronx, it's just because in the data, it's the best proxy we have for what's happening to the
Yeah.
200,000 units citywide.
And the percent changes are annual percent changes or total in the period between 19 and 23?
It's over the whole period. I'm sorry, I just have to pause.
Yeah, no, that's
It's,
okay. No, no,
and it's
I'm
real.
trying to-
It's real dollars.
Yeah, got it.
Right.
Real
It's not
dollars
the
between-
it's not the compounded rate. The only one was
Got it.
with compounded was the
Got
other
it.
one.
So if I looked at the one,
Right.
the first two columns, the 1 to 75%, I do see a different story.
Right. That's right. In real terms, let's be explicit. Gross income went up in the 1 to 25.
Yeah,
The expenses
went up at a rate less than.
went up.
Yeah.
Right? They increased the expenses. NOI also went up in real terms. The property taxes fell. You can make your own judgment about how the city does its property tax system. But at the time of the pandemic, I think there were a lot of adjustments made.
Right.
And to the extent that those are, I don't want to generalize, but they're probably in Manhattan, the ones that are most fully decontrolled.
Yeah.
So they're market rate units. It's a high proportion during the pandemic. Those rents fell a lot, and a lot of units were empty, and now they're recovering as those units, the market rate units, fill back up. So you got lots of dynamics
Yeah.
here. But I want to make sure that we're clear here. The Bronx was only used as a proxy for the 200,000. It's not, we're not just talking about Bronx. We're not just talking about Bronx units. We used, the only way we could get to the data which we thought was closest to what's happening in the 200,000 is to focus on the Bronx, right? And to give us, the trends.
So this is on the 200,000, was there anything else on the 300,000?
No, as I glossed over there, we're trying to get more data on that. But part of the problem is this is not your problem, right? My point is here, the point here is the data, that to the extent that everybody thinks that everybody's at the median, that's a problem, because it's much more complicated, the stock that is covered by what you do. And so we believe as a research issue, we should have more nuance here in the data so people can understand, despite what the legislature decided in 2019 about restricting it, about the nuances out here and the unintended consequences of not paying attention to those nuances.
Follow up on this discussion about where does the median sit relative to the extreme. So this is pre-1974, so I guess that's only 1 in 15 buildings or so are post-74, so this does correspond to the majority of the stock. But do you know how many buildings fall into those different columns? So how many are in 1 to 25, 26 to 70?
Sure. They're about equal.
About equal.
But not equal. And am I talking about the buildings or the units? I can't remember. I can give you that data. But
One thing I'm going to ask Andrew.
The 76 to 100 is the biggest. It is the biggest. But it depends what borough you're in. The 76 to 100% is the biggest category.
Oh, that's the biggest category.
Yeah, definitely.
Because, just this point of how much should we be concerned just about the Bronx versus the whole housing stock, it seems a little concerning there that even among the 76 to 100,
Right.
so that's the biggest
Right.
category, they're also having declines in expenses,
Oh, yeah.
right? So that's not just a Bronx story, it's not just a 100% story, it's a pretty large segment of the
Right.
entire stock that's declining
Right.
in expenses, and then
Right.
even in that 26 to 75% category, their NOI is going up,
Right.
their expenses are going up at a much lower rate than the other one.
So we would estimate that the 400,000 is the pre-74 stock.
Units.
Yeah. In the pre-74,
100%.
76 to 100%, there are
100%.
400,000 units, if that is helpful. Right, and this subsidizes a relatively small proportion, actually, of the overall total. But say that there's 300 there, then of the million, there's another 300, right? That would be in between.
I have a question. So you frame your talk around HSTPA and unintended consequences. If this continues, right, where there's no vacancy reset, on an apartment that was occupied for 40 years, the landlord can rent it essentially at our increase to a new tenant. So an apartment occupied for 40 years becomes occupied, they get the RGB on the new tenant above the $800 rent. So in my opinion, sort of industry, specialist, that the benefit of a landlord who has, a large rent-stabilized component, when they would get those apartments back pre-HSTPA, they could renovate and bring it to market, and that market rent offset the stabilized rents. Now, if this regime sort of continues with no incentive to improve those units, no real incentive to maybe improve as they would if they were getting a return on a new market rate unit, this will continue, this distress, as a result of HSTPA. Do you think that that's accurate?
If rents, all I said is if rents can only go up at HSTPA, then over time, the gap will grow increasingly larger. Yes.
Sure, absolutely.
I just wanted to clarify with people talking about expenses going down, but this is inflation adjusted, all these figures, right? So if it's adjusting for inflation, it may mean that they may be spending more on expenses, but at a lower rate than the inflation.
The nominal may have gone up slightly, yes.
Yeah, and also you're also adjusting for inflation a year after the last year's figures. So this is through 2023, but you're adjusting it based on 2024 dollars. So
Yeah, it doesn't matter
Yeah.
in terms of the percentage increases.
Okay.
But what we did do here is, since the most recent CPI year over year we have is for 2024, so that's why
Right.
we use 2024.
and also just one more thing. Back in 2019, I think we were still doing pre 47 buildings, not pre 74.
Yeah, in this thing, it's NOPV, so we weren't
Oh.
troubled by that. That's why we went to this data source. That's a very good point.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
I just want to respond, and this is not about your presentation, which I appreciate, just to Christina's comments. I just want to, for the rest of the board and the public members, I just want to note that we need to keep in mind that, yes, we're talking about post-2019 and your forecast for some of these buildings that are 100% or have a lot of rent-stabilized units and what that could mean for owners and maintenance, et cetera. We can't ignore or act like pre-19 didn't happen, and all of the abuses and the outpacing of Rent Guidelines Board increases that were out of whack with actually what owners' expenses were for 40 years. And so I say this because we need to make sure that this is in context historically. And I will go back to the fact that from the report that we were looking at today, cash assistance cases are up 16%, SNAP up 3%, unemployment is up, real wages went down, inflation went up 3.8% for the second year in a row that we've been looking at this data. Shelter increased 8.7% and 8.7% when you're excluding asylum seekers and 8.6% including asylum seekers. And residential evictions were up 22%. Because that's what we were here to talk about today, and I just want to continue to harp back to that when we're looking at this larger picture, that's all.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Mark. I want to ask, if you could make sure you provide us with the presentation?
I have it.
Okay, great.
Definition, you have it.
Okay, we have it. It's on you. But also B, there may be follow-up questions because
No,
we're
please.
all just sort of absorbing
Right.
this for the first time.
Yeah.
That if we can, kind of coordinate with Andrew, kind of follow-up questions that we maybe want you to ask,
Right.
or any supplemental analysis we may ask you to do.
Right.
Very much appreciated. Thank you.
I
Thank you for coming.
assume, I apologize if it was a little nerdy, but I appreciate your listening to it.
By definition, what we do, yeah. But we appreciate and also the really attempt to bring this data to forward. Thank you. All I would say is that this is another data point for us to look at. There are many other data points we're going to see in the next several weeks. And I think it's important that we be looking at all these data points as we're because what I do take from this, Mark, is you're not recommending one way or the other, and you're also saying that Rent Guidelines Board, these are policy issues that go well beyond,
Correct.
our ability to resolve or fix.
Right.
And I know you're talking as Furman more broadly. I would encourage you to do that,
Right.
and want to thank you for coming here
Right.
today.
And I offer to have conversations and input from everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other matters for the board today?
I just want to remind the owner members on the board and the tenant member that for our 24th meeting, inviting whoever you'd like, if you can start organizing that and let me know. I'm fine up to a couple of days beforehand to set the agenda. So by April 22nd, maybe you can get me everyone who's coming. That'd be great.
And just to that, we do have one more then public meeting after the 24th, which is on May 22nd.
Yeah, and by the way, we have, I did in the email say that we're going to run probably till at least 1 o'clock next week, so if you can plan accordingly. But on May 22nd, we have this the whole day. So we can
So if there's
invite-
folks that we haven't heard from, and I'm looking at everybody, I'm open to a conversation.
So we have the
about
May
having them come in.
22nd, we can be here all day if we want. It would be
If we
easier.
want.
It would be easier, I think, to have a meeting that lasts a little longer than trying to find another date that works for everybody. So that's,
Andrew's, I was like, well, maybe we could do something on like May 15th, and Andrew was getting a little nervous, but why don't we do it this? I'll
which
look
I'm
across-
open to, but
I know he is, I know he
logistically,
is.
we
I have
can
very
be
sharp, I have
here.
very hard shins, let me
we
be
can
clear.
be here all day if we wanted to.
But I also would say that I am really open to ideas about who else we want to come in, that bring unique perspectives around the data, that give us something that we don't otherwise get. I mean, the staff does an amazing job, but it's 3 of them. So I know there's a lot more out there, so to the extent anybody, please talk to me, and we'll try to see if we can accommodate it. With that, I guess I ask for a motion to adjourn. Second. We all say yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
It wasn't all me. No, it's a little bit more advanced.